But have you ever thought of refinancing your investments? Well, if you haven't, stay tuned to this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. Welcome to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton, here with my good friend and co-host, Sarah Samuels. And today we're going to be talking about refinancing your investments. So you might be thinking, what the heck is he talking about, refinancing investments? Well, stay tuned for today's show and you will absolutely find out. But first of all, haven't seen you. I've been up in my Connecticut office for several weeks. How have you been?
Well, I've been great, Dave. And of course, it's great to be here with you and to see you again. I know that you're actually fresh back from a vacation. You look tan. You look like you got some sun, hopefully.
Yeah, I took some time off in the Northeast. I was up in Newport and Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, which is really nice. Labor Day week, I usually like to take off, and it's just great that time of year up there.
Yeah, you get some fishing in or family time.
Got some fishing in. Oh, sure. Spent some good time with some close friends. So
Nice.
It was good stuff. But now I'm glad to be back down here with you, Sarah, most importantly.
Well, absolutely, Dave. And I'm excited for today's show. We have a jam-packed show scheduled for all of our listeners. Today's show, it's really talking, like Dave said, about the benefit of locking in rates when it makes sense for you.
Yeah, refinancing your investments, as we like to call it.
Refinancing your investments.
It's a funny term because nobody, ever thinks about it. They don't think about, they think about, okay, I need to refinance my mortgage when I can get a better deal, or maybe even a car loan when I get a better deal, or even credit cards. They might refinance and flip them over and get 0% interest for 12 months in the right financial environment. But they don't think about refinancing their investments. And, it really has to do when you're trying to make that transition we always talk about in the show. That's so important, from being a total return focused person in those accumulation years of your life, right?
Yep.
And then you go into the income years where now it's about income first, growth second. But people forget in the middle, there's those transition years, 10 years before retirement, where you've got to start, or at least you should be starting to make that transition from the accumulation years to the income years, where all of a sudden now you're starting to look at an income first, growth second approach. And that's really a refinancing of different sorts that you're doing at that time.
Right. And I think a lot of people, it might be hard for them to understand that transition phase because they know a lot about the growth phase, right? They know a lot about growing their investments. Maybe they know a little bit about the phase afterwards, the income phase. But that transition phase is so critical because that is money you can strategically reinvest your portfolio while you're still working, make it work for you. So it's important to know when is the right time and how you can refinance your investments.
Well, not only is it important to time it from an interest rate standpoint, but it's also important to time it from an investment loss standpoint, right? We had 13 years at the beginning of the century where the market was underwater. So in theory, if you refinanced too late and made this change too late, you get a lot less income in retirement. And that's why this isn't like a switch where you turn it on and off. One day you retire, boom, you go from total return without caring about where it comes from to all of a sudden income first, growth second. It's more of a rheostat. It happens gradually.
Right. There's that transition period we always talk about. Let's get into our first Ask Dave question. This comes from Clark in North Carolina. He says, Dave, I want to refinance my investments. Is that something that I should do now or should I wait?
All right, Clark. Well, welcome to the show here. Good to have your question. And, my best gut instinct, I won't bury the lead here. I'll tell you what I think right up front, and then we'll go from there. If you are within that 10 years of retirement, or maybe you're retired, you haven't made that transition yet, I think now might be a really opportune time. And here's why. Clark, when you refinance debts, you want to do it when interest rates are low, right? Lock in a low rate. But when you're refinancing your investments and you're trying to make this transition, you want to do it when interest rates are high. So hopefully you can lock in a high interest payment or a high dividend payment. And right now, interest rates are still pretty darn high. Now, they've come back a little bit over the last 2 months because the market's anticipating that the Federal Reserve is going to lower interest rates really just next week, which is most likely to happen. Everyone seems to be arguing are they going to lower by a quarter point or a half point. We don't know. But they're going to start the cycle of lowering. And Clark, some economists are saying that within 2 years, we'll probably see rates back down, rates that are now up over 5, the Fed funds rate. We might see that back down to 2.5 or 3. So that would mean now is probably the perfect time for you to refinance. Now, if you're more than 10 years out of retirement, or you're really behind the 8 ball and need more growth, okay, maybe you can't do it at this point. But if you're within that transition period, that 10 years or close to it, and you feel like you've saved enough, you saved enough to get by in retirement, well then now I believe is the best time. Because again, you refinance debts when interest rates are low, Clark, and you refinance your investments hopefully at the beginning of that transition period, and you do it when interest rates are high. And the good thing about interest rates is not like the stock market where you're guessing. The Federal Reserve is telegraphing that they plan to lower interest rates.
Yep. And we should hear more about that next week. But Clark, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if any of our listeners would like to ask Dave a question that may end up on a future show, all you have to do is email us at askdave@retirementincomesource.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton. And today we're talking about the concept of refinancing your investments. A lot of people are familiar with refinancing their debt, but now is the time where you should take a look at refinancing your investments. Specifically, Dave, if people are within that 10 years, that transition period before they retire.
And sometimes if you've saved enough, you could be 12 to 15 years out of retirement and start making the transition. Again, it's not a light switch. It's not on or off. It's a rheostat. You turn it a little bit. We mentioned just before that last question that, from 2000 to 2012, we had a 13-year period where the market's underwater. So imagine if in 2000 we're having the show, right? And somebody listened and said, well, I'm not within 10 years. I got 13 years yet. I don't want to retire until 2012 or 13. They would have been underwater that entire time. And looking back, the best time to have made that investment, quote, refinancing, if you will, would have been right then in 2000. So it really depends upon several factors. Number one, do you have enough money there? Have you saved enough where you're going to be okay? And by the way, you said it great before that you reinvest the interest and dividends to get some growth.
Yeah.
So
it's an important inflation hedge. It's important overall, especially if you don't need that money right then for income.
At today's interest rates, even if you were to invest almost exclusively for interest and dividends and reinvest it, your interest and dividends over the next 12 years will just about double.
Wow.
So that means that even if you're halfway there to retirement, you can still make that transition if you're further than 10 years out, because even if you're income only, you're still not giving up growth. You're growing your income. Right. And you're doing it with more of a known commodity.
Yeah, it's kind of like the football analogy, right? Like if you're in you just finished the second quarter, right? You're in the halftime. If you have enough points to win the game, you don't really screw it up, right? You kind of transition more to your defensive strategy and protecting what you have.
Right. Now you have to be careful because any sports fans who are listening are going to talk about how many times that a team went to prevent defense, right, and then they lost. Right?
All right, there's always the exception to the rule. Okay.
Because there are exceptions, but generally speaking, if you're ahead 2 or 3 touchdowns, you have a few minutes left, okay, you want to hold on that lead. You want to run up the clock. You don't want to turn over the ball, right?
Right.
Because the more you put the ball, okay, well, I want to rack up the score. I want some insurance because I remember all those times when prevent defense failed, right?
Yeah.
Well, okay, that's great, but you put the ball up in the air, and guess what? You have a chance of it getting intercepted.
Absolutely, and things can change really quickly.
And that's what happens. Essentially, if you don't make that transition to an income first, growth second approach soon enough, you get intercepted, you have a turnover, and sometimes they run it back for a touchdown, and now you're really, really behind the 8 ball. So coming up, we're going to talk a lot more about this concept of refinancing your investments, when to do it, when not to do it, and also more about how to do it. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and right now might be the time for you to refinance your investments. And yes, you heard that correctly. We're talking about how to refinance your investments. We're not talking about how to refinance your debt. And right now with high interest rates, it is the best time. And there's really a small window, and it's closing with the Fed scheduled to meet next week and predicted to lower interest rates. But right now might be the best time for you to really lock in those interest rates, right, Dave? And there's a couple other conditions too as well.
Yeah, if you're in the right situation, it could be the best time. And nobody has a crystal ball, right? The Fed could completely reverse course and start raising rates. But then that would cause really the stock market to make a significant drop. So you can argue that even if that were the case, it's not a bad time to start refinancing your investments from, growth first, income second to an income first, growth second approach, because when the stock market drops, you have fewer dollars to refinance with.
Yeah. And I think too, Dave, that for most people, if they're within that 10 years to retirement and they've saved enough money, now is really the time that they need to invest. They need to look at refinancing those investments and seeing what they can do to get the most for retirement.
If you saved enough. That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. Because there are some times when you may not want to do the refinance. Okay. So, for example, one time is if you haven't saved enough. You could be 5 years out of retirement. You have maybe a half of what you need, right? You're just not going to get there.
Yeah.
So you say, I still need the growth component. I need a lot of G, right? Now, there's still answers for that. We'll talk about that later on the show, which you can do if you're behind the eight ball. But at least you've got to be careful about how you do it if you're behind the eight ball.
Well, you don't want to take too much risk and do things that you're not comfortable with in your investments just to try to make up for that loss or that lost time.
That's right. So there's smart ways to do it. But at least I understand where that's a place you may want to take pause, even if you're really close to retirement, if you don't have enough saved, invested for retirement. The other thing is if you're far out from retirement, if you're too young, right? That's a time when you might want to say, okay, I can let time take over. And there's going to be valleys. And if there's a 13-year valley, I'm young enough, it doesn't matter. I'm putting money in. I'm dollar cost averaging. I'm buying more shares when the market's down. So it's still a better strategy. Okay, so that's the second time.
Yep.
And the third time is probably the best of all. It's my favorite. Is for those of you who have saved, invested so much money that you can live off a dividend. Okay, so let's say right now the average dividend on the S&P 500 is call it 1.4%. I think it's 1.3 actually today. And you have $10 million. Wow, you've saved, you've invested, you've done an incredible job. So now you've got $70,000 coming in from Social Security and retirement between both of you. And you get a 1.3% dividend. It's $130,000 a dividend on $10 million. And you say, $10 million, that's all $200,000 is all I ever need, right? Then that's a time where you might say, you know what? I don't want to make a change. I don't want to go to an income first, growth second approach. So I want to leave a big legacy because, again, I'll have plenty of income because I've saved way more than I need. So, Sarah, those are the three times when you at least want to sit back and maybe consider not doing it.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering, Dave, you mentioned that if you're too far out from retirement, maybe 15, 20, 25 years even out from retirement, it might not be a good time for you to make the transition. But I'm wondering if there are any exceptions to this rule, because we have a question here from Miranda in Georgia, and she says, I'm not your normal listener. I'm actually in my early 40s. I'm probably more than 20 years out from retirement. But would it make sense for me to make this transition?
So, Miranda, generally speaking, no. Because even if you went from 2000 to 2020, for the first 13 years being underwater, you would have averaged 6% had you just been in the Standard & Poor's 500 in a simple index fund. But if you were contributing money during that time into your 401k, you were dollar cost averaging, right? You were buying more shares when the markets were down, buying fewer shares when the markets were up. So your dollar weighted return was much more than 6%. That's why the general rule is no, okay? But here's the exception, Miranda. Let's say you've been a really good saver and you have enough and you say, okay, I'm really conservative. I don't want to see a stock market pull back just emotionally. It happened in 2008. I was mid-20s then, didn't have a lot of money, but it would kill me today. All right, if that's you and if you feel like you're conservative and you feel like you've saved enough, where just a simple 5 or 6% growth through reinvested interest and dividends can get you to retirement over the next 20 years, then it's okay. Because you never want to take more risk than you're comfortable with. And because you want to be able to sleep at night. Your money is supposed to be there for you so you can put your head on your pillow and feel comfortable. If your money is giving you stress, well, that's a big no-no. So again, if you are really conservative, Miranda, and you feel like, hey, I just can't stomach a drop, and at the same time, you feel like you've saved enough for over the next 20 years, just another 5 or 6% dividend reinvestment or interest reinvestment would get you there, then it's okay to make that reduction earlier on. And yes, Miranda, I've even had some clients where they're your age or even late 30s where they've said, no, I just don't have the stomach for it. I want to make this change. So that's where you kind of have to know yourself, right? Socrates said, know thyself, and just make the right decision.
Yep. Miranda, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. Of course, we appreciate you listening. We appreciate all of our listeners, even if they're maybe not in the target range of people that we really talk to, that age range. So thank you for sending in your question. If any of our listeners or even our YouTube viewers have a question that you would like to get answered potentially on a future show, all you have to do is email us at askdave@retirementincomesource.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and we are talking about refinancing your investments and that all-important transition that happens before you retire, typically about 10 years or so before you retire. So, Dave, we've talked a lot about when to make this transition, right? When it's the right time. If you've saved enough, you're about 10 years or so out from retirement. Particularly now, there's maybe a small window, maybe it's closing as the Fed will be lowering interest rates, but there's a great time now to lock in those higher interest rates. But there's people that this maybe won't work for them, potentially people like Miranda that are in their 30s and 40s that, unless they have a really high risk aversion, right?
Yeah.
They really should be in those growth stocks at that age.
And I wonder how well Miranda's done.
Yeah.
Be interesting to know. It's one thing she left off her question, but if we had known, roughly, hey, I'm halfway toward retirement, I would say, hey, you can do it. With 20 years to go, you might even be able to say, gosh, if I'm 40% or 35% toward my retirement goal, just reinvesting 5 or 6% could get her the rest of the way. So that very well could work for somebody like her.
Yeah. And you mentioned something important, that's risk tolerance, and how really that's a personal thing, and that's going to differ between every single person. So if you have someone, they've no risk aversion, like Miranda, they saved enough and they say, you know what, Dave, I cannot stomach, it will make me sick to think about losing my money, then maybe this is an option for them. But it's about knowing your risk tolerance.
It's like in my household, right? Yeah. Teresa's younger than me.
Yeah.
Not by
significantly
a ton,
younger, right?
Well, it clicked over to 8 years now instead of 7 because I just had a birthday.
Okay, that's not
she'll catch up to me in a few months. But it's still at a point where I love what I do. We plan to run this company for a long time. We have plenty of money invested. We have plenty of income coming in. She could take risk and not worry about it, right? But she's so conservative that just a few weeks ago, we're out shopping bank CD rates. Literally shopping bank CD rates because we talked about rates going down. And I said, well, if you want to do it now. And it makes no sense because the reality is this is money she might use for income but doesn't need it. But it's not money she's going to use to buy a car in a year or two, which is when you buy a CD.
Right, that's when it makes sense, a lump sum.
It could be legacy money for nieces and nephews, but even then, at her age, I mean, heck, she should live 30, 40 more years.
Right,
so,
and she's healthy. You guys are both really healthy, fit,
So it doesn't make any sense, but she's so conservative. And, I don't want to hear any of my clients call me up in a panic because rates are down. And then when you live with one of your clients, it's even more the case. I don't want to hear it. So we went CD shopping. We found some decent rates. So there you go.
Good. Well, it's important, Dave, to work with all of your clients, right? No matter if maybe their conservativeness is a bit irrational, but you're working with them, right?
That's what I said to her. I said, you're like my worst, most nervous client. I can't believe I'm actually in the car driving from bank to bank shopping rates with you.
I can see it. That's funny. But hey, that's awesome you went with her. I feel like that's great to be supportive. Plus, you have so much knowledge about it. She probably felt it's like when you bring your boyfriend or someone that's like a mechanic, right? You bring them with you to get the car checked out because you know a little bit, but you feel good because they know a lot more about it than you do.
That's one place I cannot help Teresa, Josie. Just in case you're wondering, just all of our listeners, that's one place I cannot help. If you give me a screwdriver, you've got a 50% chance that I use the right end.
Right. Yeah. Well, hey, we won't be putting you to the mechanic test anytime soon, right? We won't have you work on any cars here. But we're going to continue this discussion and help people to understand. Maybe you're one of those people Dave mentioned earlier. You're behind the 8 ball. You haven't saved enough for retirement. We're going to talk about some potential solutions for you and if you should take advantage of the high interest rate environment while it lasts. I'm Sarah Samuels. I'm here with David Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and your window of opportunity to lock in the higher interest rates may be closing. We know the Fed is meeting next week. They're predicted to actually lower interest rates. Of course, that could all change. But all this really goes into our conversation about when it's the time to refinance your investments. We've talked about when it's the right time, when it's not the right time. And we've talked about, Dave, some of those people that maybe they just can't stomach the thought of losing their money. They have a really low risk tolerance. So how does risk tolerance play a part in whether or not you should take advantage right now? You should refinance your investments.
Well, it's funny. Yeah, right before the break, we talked about in my own household, right?
Yeah.
Teresa and I shopping for bank CDs, which is, to me, that was just like, oh gosh, you're killing me. But also, I want her to be happy, and I know how much stress she'll have. Yeah. I mean, the amount of stress she'd have from an investment loss, believe it or not, would be even more than if the cleaning lady came and did a poor job cleaning the house. I just want to say that would be...
That's hard to imagine,
yeah.
Dave.
And for Italian females, that's a big deal when, the house doesn't get cleaned well enough. So that would be an issue. And even Miranda, Miranda, being, if she's more conservative, that would make some sense.
Right. And that was our last Ask Dave question.
Right.
Yeah.
To say make a change, and I think that works. But, it's funny, there's risk tolerance plays into it for sure. And then there's also the people that save so much money, like I said a moment ago, where you save so much that you need a very small percentage income off your asset base. And I've got that. I've got a client I could think of that's got about $20 million invested. He lives fairly conservatively. And for him, just getting 1.3% dividend is fine. It's $250,000 a year of income. And if he can get some other supplemental income, he's great. He's got some of his money invested for higher income to supplement it a little bit. But it's not like he needs to make $1 million a year just because he has 20 million. So that's all different.
Yep, and it's kind of like that concept of the millionaire next door, right? A lot of people that have managed to save enough, maybe they've done well financially. A lot of them do live conservatively.
Yeah,
they're not spending a lot.
Which is kind of sad because we talk about this on the show all the time, Sarah. The fact that you can people. If most people knew that they could spend more, they would. And the reason most of those people don't spend is because they feel like it's irresponsible. I worked so hard my entire life to save this money to put it away that now if I just start withdrawing money to spend it, oh my goodness, so irresponsible. I don't want to do that.
Right. They start to feel guilty about it.
Well, that's because they're thinking about withdrawing money. That's the problem with that term. When the reality of it is they're not withdrawing money. If they're making that transition to an income first, growth second approach, they're living off the interest, preserving the principal. They're trying to get growth also, but they're definitely not taking any principal. And that's the first thing. So that's the problem. When I hear people with lots of money like that being willing to live off a small percentage, even though it might be $250,000 a year, it's still, if they realize what they could do with another $300,000 or $400,000 a year of income, how that could change their lives or their families' lives, or maybe do good things for some charity or some others, I think they might feel more liberated to do it, but they feel guilty, so they just won't.
Yeah. Well, that's why the income strategy is so unique, because it really gives you that ability. It's like a gift, right? It's that ability to spend that money guilt-free. You're not withdrawing money. You're not taking away from your principal to pay for things. You're using that money you generated, that your investments generated, to pay for that kitchen renovation or that new car. Exactly. So it's very freeing. But let's get into our Ask Dave question. We actually have someone here. We have Jody from Pennsylvania. She says, I'm behind on investing. During the pandemic, I had to dip into my savings. I wish I had saved more. But the biggest problem is that I also hate risk. What should I do? So this is a tough one, Dave.
Well, Jody, I guess it depends in large part about how far behind you really are. Did Jody say, how far is she away from retirement? Did she say?
Let me see. It looks like she's 5 years or so.
She's 5 years, okay. Yeah. All right. So here are the factors you have to think about, Jody. Okay? Number one, if you were to make a change now and get zero growth, but reinvest and have, let's say you can get 5.5% today of income. So whatever amount of assets you have, assume you get 5% of income, and that income will grow by 5.5% for the next 5 years. Now you have to ask yourself, where will that bring you, and can you get by on that? And if it's not enough, then you might have to figure out, okay, how many more years does that have to grow at 5 or 5.5% to get to where you can stand to retire? Because it might be a 3-year postponement or a 5-year postponement. And you might say, you know what, I'm healthy enough, I'm willing to do that. I'm risk averse. I don't want to take the risk. I don't want to be stressed about my money. So if it means making the change first, and I know I've got to work 5 more years, I can get my head around that, right? Then I think that's a good thing. And most people are fine if they can get their head around it and they know they've got to work 5 more years. It's when you plan to retire and all of a sudden the markets drop. You haven't made that transition quickly enough to an income first, growth second approach. And now your head's not fixed around set to work 5 more years, but you have to. So if those are the cases where it's a few more years, then I think you're fine. If it's more than that, then one of the things you might want to consider, Jody, is you might want to consider high dividend common stocks. You can get into higher dividend common stock strategies. You won't be getting as much income as you will if you have you go into bonds or preferreds or things like that. But at least you can get more income than you're probably getting in your portfolio today and still have a lot of upside potential. And if the market goes sideways and takes a major drop, at least you should be somewhat cushioned, because those high dividend stocks tend to drop a lot less than the growth stocks. So if you're talking about, gee, if I make the transition now, I'm pushing retirement out 10 or 15 years, and I'm unwilling to do that, but I'm also unwilling to take risk, then maybe the compromise is a higher dividend stock strategy. And, that gives you a chance to get out a little bit earlier without taking as much risk. So you're taking a little bit of risk and maybe working a little bit longer, but it's not extreme on either end.
And Jody, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if any of our listeners have a question maybe about retirement or a strategy that you've heard and you would like to ask Dave, all you have to do is email us. Our email address is askdave@retirementincomesource.com. And thank you for joining us today here on Retirement Income Source, where it is all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and we are talking about the concept of refinancing your investments. A lot of people say, hey, I know about refinancing my debt, but there is a time and a place to refinance your investments, particularly if you've saved enough for retirement and you're 10 years away. It's a great time to really make that transition and to think about those years before you actually retire, those income years. So Dave, in our last question just a few minutes ago from Jody, she was someone that really didn't want to take a lot of risk, but she hadn't saved enough, and she also really wasn't willing to work more than 5 years that she had planned. And you mentioned that common stock, that high dividend common stocks could be an option for her. But how do people even determine, let's say, is there some sort of formula that our listeners could use to determine if maybe they're behind the 8 ball, if they're in a similar situation?
Well, I think that formula that I gave Jody is pretty close. If you say, okay, I can get 5.5% today, take the amount of money you have times 5.5%, and then grow it at 5.5% over the next few years, and see when that income gets to a big enough number where you can actually retire.
Right.
And see, and then maybe have compromises. Okay, take a little bit less income, get a little more growth. So now, like Jody, she's taking a little less risk if she goes from a more diversified stock portfolio to a higher dividend common stock portfolio. But she's also getting a little more income, so she's hedging the bets on both sides.
Yeah, and I think too that for a lot of people, they have to look at the big picture. They have to look at when they're retiring, what their plans are. You mentioned, Jody, if you're willing maybe to do 10 years, you can maybe make up some lost ground here too.
She works 5 more years. Again, it's one thing if you get to the brink of retirement and now you find out you have to work 5 more years. That's not a good day.
Yeah.
But if you 5 years out and you get your head around it now, maybe that's all right. Maybe that'll work.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to think. That's why you have to think about this in advance. That's why 10 years before is a great time with that transition period coming to start to think about it.
Right. And meet with a financial advisor, or truly an income specialist that specializes in this transition period that can help you, like we mentioned, strategically reinvest that income if you don't need it during those working years to grow your portfolio, but someone that can help you through this whole transition.
And the hardest part is, like in Jody's case, when we spoke about that, she won't lock in her income if she does the high dividend common stock strategy. Coming up, I want to talk more about some of the ways you can lock it in, right? But we know that dividends on common stocks tend to be sticky. Most companies don't like to cut the dividend. It's bad for the stock. Now, we get a terrible market. Some companies will cut dividends, but other companies will continue to grow the dividend. So dividends don't necessarily lock it in. You're not necessarily refinancing your money.
Yeah.
But what they do is make it more sticky. So in her case, again, she's compromising on all levels. A little less income, a little income that's not guaranteed, but also a little less risk, because at this point, that's the best she can do is diversify her approach. And coming up, I want to talk more about how to actually lock in the income. Yeah. So when you're doing a refinance of your investments, how you literally lock in your income moving forward into those retirement years. I'm David Scranton here at Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton, here with my good friend Sarah Samuels, and today we're talking about refinancing your investments. So if you're just joining us, you're probably wondering, what the heck is he talking about? Well, as you know, you refinance your debts oftentimes to get low interest rates, and you want to do that when rates are low. But when you refinance your investments, well, you want to do that when rates are high. And also, when else do you want to do it? You want to do it when you're close to retirement. So it's that transition period within 10 years or so before retirement that you start to go from a total return focus, regardless of where it's coming from, the income or the growth, to an income first, growth second approach. So, Sarah, I think we talked a lot about that so far today, about how it's refinancing your investments, right? You refinance your debts when rates are low, refinance your investments when rates are high. We also talked about a few situations where maybe you just don't want to.
Right. There's always the exception to the rule, especially if you're someone maybe with a very low risk tolerance. You don't like to take a lot of risk, and maybe you haven't saved enough for retirement. So there's different things you might have to compromise on depending on which situation you're in, especially, on the other end of that spectrum, right? We have the people that have maybe saved, they have too much essentially, right? Even if they were to invest and just get that 1.5% dividend, they've got $10 million. They can live off that. They're good to go, So it's a whole spectrum.
Like you said, the millionaire next door.
Right, the millionaire next door, living very cheaply.
The 10 millionaire next door.
$10 million,
multi-millionaire,
$150
right? A year still gets you a pretty good lifestyle. I know you make a lot of money. I know you're kind of highfalutin, but but still, it's 150.
Hey, I got to keep up. We're in South Florida,
right?
I got to keep up with the Joneses here.
I know you wouldn't get out of bed and drive to the office for 150 a year,
but
yet there's some, that think that's a lot of money.
Yeah, at least $1 million biller here,
But that's why I used to love Sarah before she found all this newfound fame and fortune now, and she thinks 150 isn't a lot. But Sarah, I want to talk a little bit about, we talked about how common stocks don't really refinance because they don't lock in the income, so you can cut dividends. But, let's talk for a moment about how people can so-called lock in that income.
Yeah, what should they do right now?
Yeah. The most common tool is bonds, right? When you own a stock, you own equity in a company. When you own a bond, you're essentially lending money to a company. So when you lend money to a company, they have to pay you interest, right? So this is where if you're the borrower, you want to borrow when rates are low. When you're the lender, you want to lend when rates are high and lock in that rate. And that's essentially what a bond does. You could buy bonds that go out many, many years. That'll lock in that interest payment to you through, if not all your retirement, a good part of your retirement. If you want to get a little bit more and you're willing to take a little bit more risk, you can go to preferred stock. Preferred stock is a totally different class of stock, right? It's not like common stock, because with preferred, the dividend is set. It's set in the contract that they have to pay that particular rate of dividend. And that dividend comes as just like an interest payment, right? It's different verbiage, but it really functions the same. And both bonds and preferreds don't fluctuate nearly as much as common stocks because, again, they're more of a debt instrument. They're more of and preferreds technically are not a debt instrument, but they function a lot like it. So, again, if you want to refinance a debt and you're a borrower, you want to do it when rates are low. If you're the lender, you want to do it when rates are high, and that's essentially where we are now. But I don't think we're going to be there for much longer.
Yep. The most important part, though, is knowing when is the right time for you specifically. And our next question here for Ask Dave comes from Mark in Delaware. He says, Dave, even if I refinance my investments and I lock in the rates right now, I know that companies can still default. So how do I protect against that?
Well, what's his name?
Mark, Delaware.
Okay, Mark. We have all East Coast today. What do we have?
Yeah, a lot of East Coasters
North Carolina,
today.
Georgia,
Sometimes
Pennsylvania,
we get a lot
Delaware.
of West Coast people.
I know. Wow. Okay, so Mark, how do you know you're secure? Well, again, if you're a creditor, you have to look at the credit worthiness of the borrower, right? So just like you have a FICO score, I have a FICO score. Sarah, she's so wealthy, she doesn't need a FICO score because she just pays for everything in cash. But we have these FICO scores, and what the FICO score is a numeric assessment of your credit worthiness. And of course, if you have an 800 FICO score, then you can just you can borrow at the best interest rates at any given time. Now, right now, the best mortgage rate might be low sixes, right? And you can borrow at that rate. But what if you had a FICO score of 650? Well, you might still get a mortgage, but now it may not be low sixes, it may be low sevens or mid sevens. So generally speaking, the riskier, the bigger chance of default from a borrower means that the interest rate's going to be higher. So if you're conservative, and you sound like it, Mark, where you don't want to worry about defaults, then you've got to go with those that have a higher FICO score. Only in the investment world, it's not called a FICO score, it's called a rating. So you have Moody's, you have Standard & Poor's, you have Fitch, which are the three biggest rating services, and they rate. Each one rates bonds and preferreds and 15 to 25 different levels, and you want to be on one of the higher levels. So it's not like, the FICO score that maxes out at 840. It's different letter grades, but you're going to want to stick to one of the higher ones, and if you do that, then you're probably going to feel comfortable no matter what happens. Now, if you're willing to take a little bit more risk, because you're still the creditor, so you still have some rights, right? You're still the person that made the loan, and you want to take some risk, then you might want to slide down the scale just a little, and you get a higher interest payment or a higher dividend payment in case of a preferred. So, Mark, hope that helped. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yep. And Mark, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. If any of our listeners or our YouTube viewers even have a question about retirement or maybe about the strategies refinancing your investments and ways to do it that you've heard here today on the show, please reach out to us via email and send us your questions. Our email address is askdave@retirementincomesource.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it is all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton. And Dave, I'm sure our viewers want to know, I want to let you know that my credit score is actually 1,000. So I've gone past the that 800 score.
That's not an A plus. That's like an A plus plus plus.
A plus plus plus. There's no ranking for my credit. But Dave, it's
such a waste too, since you pay for everything with cash, right?
I know. I'm trying to live off the grid here.
There you go. I love it.
Yeah. But so far, Dave, we've talked about when is the right time to refinance your investments, when it might not be the right time, how it's really specific for each person's situation. Even there might be people that are behind on saving. They haven't saved enough, but they're very risk averse, and there's options for them as well. So, Dave, you mentioned bonds. You can really lock in the rates, of course, as a bond. There's that contract, and there are some bond-like instruments, we like to call them, like preferred stocks, for example. Really, one of the reasons why you consider it a bond-like instrument is because the companies are very hesitant to ever really lower that dividend, right? So it's similar.
They can. If they do, it's essentially considered a default.
There you go.
It's like you not making a mortgage payment.
Right. You defaulted on it.
That's what you defaulted. Yeah. And that's why they won't do that. And typically when that happens, then the actual common stock is worth close to zero because they've defaulted on debt. Yeah. And the equity owners don't have much left because now they have to go bankrupt, or the bondholders now have to sue to try to get the money, and it becomes really ugly. So companies typically don't do that. But you have to look at the ratings. And, we learned one thing in 2008, Sarah, during the financial crisis, that you have to also look beyond the ratings. It's not
just about the rating. Exactly.
It used to be, but, if you remember the scene from the movie The Big Short, where they're in the rating agency and they're saying, how could these bonds be selling for full price right now when, we're looking at it, we could see what's happening right here. How could he still have a AAA rating? And the lady in the bond agency, if you recall, said, well, I have to. I have to feed my family. If I don't give them a AAA rating, they'll go next door and get it from the other rating agency. Yeah. So if we didn't know before that, we certainly found out during the financial crisis that, you have to look beyond the ratings. And that's part of the reason, Sarah, why a lot of times with bonds or preferreds, people shouldn't try this alone at home. It's actually a lot easier sometimes to pick good stocks or good mutual funds. Even though income investing is more conservative, sometimes it's more difficult because you have to be essentially a credit analyst, a mortgage analyst.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people too have this misconception. A lot of people that maybe they did well, like you said, picking the stocks and the growth years, maybe they made some money, they invested well. They think, hey, I can continue doing what I did to make all this money, and that's how I'll live in retirement. And really, you need an income specialist. You need someone that can look beyond just the rating of these bonds, that can look at all of these different instruments and can suggest what's going to work for you in your situation.
I mean, the stories are just infinite about people who maybe retired in a good stock market and thought they were better at picking stocks or mutual funds than they really were. Yeah. And all of a sudden, everything turned on them. And, You know,
It's a horror story.
they panicked. Some people panicked, got out, and then the market went back up again, and they were out at a lower number. Other people just, had to go back to work or maybe live on a lot less in retirement. So, yeah, I agree. Don't try this at home.
Yep. That's not something that we want our listeners to have to deal with. So thank you so much for listening to the show. If you want to look for an income specialist, if that's something that you want to make that transition now, if you're interested, we recommend you look at our website, retirementincomesource.com. We have a helpful map there. You can find an income specialist in your area for when you're ready to make this transition.
And most important, we hope that you're here with us next week. Same time, same station. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and you've been listening to the Retirement Income Source, where, yes, it's all about the income.